thank you so much for rolling in. We are going to get started in a couple minutes, but thank you all so much for attending. If you've got questions, you can put them in the chat box for our great panelists, but we're going to get started in just a few. And we're very excited to talk with you all today about an Ask Me Anything for broadband. So, and the FCC maps. Thanks so much, everybody. Wow, cool. Numbers of attendees just keep going up. We're excited. Thanks for joining. Just to reiterate, thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to filter in whatnot. We know that folks are coming in from other meetings and things like that and are actually trying to fill out these challenge processes along the way, right? So giving folks a break from their day. But thank you all so much for being on. We are so excited to talk with you all and really have an informal type of atmosphere around talking about broadband maps and hopefully hear from the experts on the call with us today about what they see as the challenges and the processes for these. So thanks, y'all.
While we're waiting, quick icebreaker question. Christine, what's your favorite GIS platform?
Gosh, well, no, it's very controversial, but I'm going to go ahead and say ArcGIS. I'm an Esri user. I've dabbled in others, though.
The attendees just went down, so I don't know what you said, but no.
I'm so sorry.
Ryan, how about you?
I barely understand what GIS is. I am a lawyer, not a data analyst.
Alex Kelly, to you?
I don't know. KidPix, does that count? Cardo? Cardo is what we use typically, but QGIS is cool.
Esri is the only one that's ever invited me to a happy hour, so I feel like I've been bought and paid for by the Esri ArcGIS behemoth.
Fancy! I didn't know they had a happy hour. Invite only, I guess.
Probably Christine. Jake, internally to Jake Warren, honestly, from Pew Charitable Trust. I understand. It is 2:03. We're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. This webinar is brought to you by the National Broadband Resource Hub. We are really excited to hopefully fill the needs in the broadband space right now. We know that local leaders and elected officials have a lot of questions about what's going on. There are a lot of moving parts from the federal level to the state level to your own backyard, right, about what's happening. And so these panelists are gathered here today to really talk about the FCC maps and the challenge process that will be coming to a close, at least temporarily, for January the 13th deadline. And Jake Barn is going to give you a little bit more description about that. But I'm just here to introduce our panelists. I'm also going to serve as the moderator for this wonderful time that we've got together. My name is Anderson Clayton. I am a part of the Center on Rural Innovation, and I'm a broadband analyst for them. So if you've got questions, type them in the chat box, and I will be happy to ask our panelists those questions, or they will also be answering them live in the chat box potentially too. So make sure that you fill those in. But we also have questions that we've gathered from folks as they signed up for this webinar, and also folks that are questions that our panelists were just really interested in helping answer for folks. So thank you to Ryan Johnson from Next Century Cities for being with us today, Alex Kelly from the Center on Rural Innovation, Christine Parker from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and Jake Varn from the Pew Charitable Trust. And we've also got myself and Austin on here as just tech support too throughout this. So we're going to go ahead and get going. And this is also extremely informal. Like I said, we don't have a PowerPoint presentation to give you all. We just want to be able to give you the answers to the questions that you have. So starting us off is going to be to Christine first, if you could, but is the January 13th deadline the final opportunity to challenge the maps? What do we need to know about how this will impact the ongoing projects in our own backyard?
Anderson, before we jump into the questions, should we do a quick spiel of what the map is?
Oh, goodness, Jake. I skipped right on into it, didn't I? I got a little excited there. But yes, Jake, if you could give us a little knowledge and background about what this January 13th deadline is. Thank you so much. Apologies.
Yeah, no, hey. Oh, we know, informal, casual. This is what happens when we throw the PowerPoint out the window.
I know.
But yeah, please do send in questions. This is supposed to be, Q&A for anything that people have as last minute questions for this process. But yeah, so this FCC map, this new broadband availability map came out in November, released by the FCC. It is a pretty seismic shift from the previous data collection efforts that the FCC had for showing where broadband was available in this country. It was previously a census-based map, got down to the census tract level. Providers would report availability at an entire block of the census, whether or not they had service anywhere within that area. They're trying to get much more hyper-localized, showing individual homes and businesses on the map, and then having providers report based on those locations. This map is being run through its paces for the very first time by another federal agency, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, who have been tasked with administering the broadband funding from the infrastructure bill that passed 2 years ago now, a year and a half, whatever. No, I guess a year and a few months. But they've been tasked with it, and explicitly says that they should split up the money between states based off of this new map that the FCC is creating. So we have a timeline specifically now to try to submit any fixes and changes that need to be made to this map, which will be continued to be updated every 6 months, both the underlying fabric of where those locations are, as well as the provider reporting on top of if a provider services that location or has a speed available at that location. So, but in order to meet NTIA's timeline for how they would like to get money out the door so states can start funding additional broadband projects within their states, they have recommended that folks submit challenges if they see problems to the map by this Friday, January 13th. And what I think a question we alluded to, and we'll get to in more detail, challenges will continue to be submitted to this map. This is a walking backwards from June timeline of the maximum amount of time that the FCC process could take for a challenge to be resolved if the provider and the challenger are in dispute as to whether or not that challenge is valid or not. So there's a very specific process of the back and forth that can take upwards of 150 days. And so we're working backwards from that to make sure that if you want to submit a challenge, you can almost guarantee that it will be resolved one way or another before NTIA would like to set their funding allocation formula for this grant program. So that kind of what brings us here today. We're working with 2 different federal agencies. We're working with a new grant program that's standing up for the first time. We're working with state broadband offices that are very rapidly growing their capacity, many of which have been in place for decades, or at least decade and a half for some, but are now growing very quickly to try to meet this influx of federal investments. And yeah, this is kind of a new process for everybody. So there's a lot of growing pains for both how to interpret the map as well as how to properly facilitate a challenge. So yeah, with that, Christine, I'll actually turn it over to you if you want to talk through it all about the process itself for submitting a challenge. I know you all have put together some resources on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of, I guess we'll start with the basics. There are 2 different types of challenges, right? So there are the actual locations where your business or your home is located in the map. And then there's also the availability challenge, which is focused on the service that a provider is claiming to be able to provide at your location. And so the location challenge process, both, like Jake said, are going to be ongoing, but the inclusion of location challenges for BEAD allocations is already passed. That happened sometime in the fall. And so location challenges that are submitted from this point forward will be incorporated in the next iteration of the location fabric, which should be revised and distributed sometime in June, I would imagine. The availability challenges, like Jake said, they've worked back from the June map release to make sure that providers and the FCC would have enough time to resolve challenges over that timeline so that they can be incorporated in the map. So availability challenges this week is the last week to make sure you get those submitted and in order for them to be included in these allocations. And so these will, help determine where those served and unserved locations are.
And yeah, just to put one more point on that, as Christine was just describing, the fabric is given to providers ahead of these 6-month reporting windows. And so that's where Christine's saying that there's a new version of the fabric that is not currently live on the map that has already been sent to providers, and providers will report on top of it. FCC will process all that information and update the map again on this 6-month basis. The next one's coming out expected in spring, and then the fabric will once again be updated and sent to providers and submitted again. So it's going to be this kind of revolving process. For this BEAD deadline, the crux of it is these unserved locations. So it's a location that is on the map currently or will be on the map at any point, and the service that is claimed on that location. And also not just from the initial preview of the FCC map, but going in adjusting the types of providers you're looking at. So you're looking at the licensed wireless and fixed wired providers, which has an additional drop-down menu you have to go to on the FCC map to see really how that shakes out for how it will impact these BEAD allocations, this big grant funding program. And yeah, NTIA will be looking, the formula that they have for setting this is to look at the total number of unserved locations within a state or territory, the total number in the entire country, and then this a 10% of the funding is also going to be a specific proportion of how many of those unserved locations are considered to be in a high cost area, either due to the geography or topography or economic characteristics of that region. And so there'll be an additional plus up for that state if they have a significant number of high cost unserved locations. So getting really specific down to having the points be accurate on the map, but then also if it's served or unserved based on the type of provider that services it. So a few layers of nuance that we all have to work through in order to look at what actually is mattering for this specific program, this $42 billion that's coming out.
I want to jump in and start addressing some of these questions in the chat because they're great questions. And Natalie Roper has a question, and I want to start with a bit of a trying to be controversial answer here. So the question is about communities are worried about missing this January 13th deadline, which, as we've been saying, is the deadline for getting things into the maps in time for the allocations. I don't think communities are the ones who should be worried about this January 6th deadline. I think states and the states that are facilitating challenges should be the ones worried about this January 13 deadline. My colleagues can disagree, but the state should be concerned with how much money gets to that state. Putting that concern onto the localities who are not going to have the power to move the needle significantly is undue burden and stress on them. What communities should be concerned with on the community level is figuring out how to fix the maps for their areas in a concerted and accurate way sometime soon, but not necessarily by the 13th, but they should do it sometime soon, because when it comes time to facilitate applications for those grants, when the money makes it all the way through to being available, that's when communities really need to be sure that they are creating and facilitating enforceable funded obligations for whoever wins those grants to serve everyone in the community. So if the community's goals that you're referring to, Natalie, and I assume you're talking about smaller jurisdictions, if they can get it in before January 13th, great. But their goal is not necessarily maximizing the amount of money that goes to their state. That should be the state's goal. Their goal should be making sure that every single premise that needs service in their community has an opportunity to be funded, and therefore, has an opportunity to create an enforceable obligation to be built. So I hope that helps. And I'm going to kick it over to maybe Ryan to answer question number 2. or number 3?
I can handle both of them. So, but no, the second question that came in is, I'll just read it verbatim here, is that our county does not have location data, making it impossible to submit a bulk challenge. The data for our county is significantly inaccurate on the map, I'm assuming. The timeline given to challenge this map is too short, and when done over a major holiday period is ineffective. So how do you remedy that issue? In this case, really, if you have the ability to go out and collect that data, it is never too late to do that, to make sure that that fabric data gets included in the next iteration of what the map will look like. The way that NTIA set up this deadline and kind of what Alex just touched on is that NTIA's allocation will kind of be based on what the 13th looks like, but hopefully the NTIA will continue to look at the map past that and make updates and make revisions to what their allocations will look like based on what we're looking at the closer we get to June. So certainly, if you have the ability to collect that data and submit it, please do that. And then on the third question is regarding the formatting of a bulk availability challenge. So what that needs to look like is, to the question, yes, you will absolutely need to reference both the licensed location fabric, that specific location ID that is attached to a location on the fabric needs to be referenced in a bulk availability challenge. That should be also available from the free downloadable data that you can just pull off of the map. You shouldn't need a license for that, but that is one of the specific things you will need to make a bulk availability challenge. And then I'll kick it to Christine.
I just wanted to circle back quick to the timeline with availability challenges. And while this is like kind of viewed as a hard deadline, this is a deadline to make sure that your challenge has the full extent of time to be included. It doesn't mean if you submit things like next week that they wouldn't be evaluated. It's just they are not going to have as much time to make sure they're processed. So if there's simple challenges, it's very possible that they could still be resolved. So just something to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, I for one submitted a challenge on my address, and it took a little while. That the provider has a set amount of time, 30 days, I think, to respond to it, but has been, and they conceded the challenge. So it is very much possible to have these challenges resolved faster than this 150 days, but that is they're trying to be as transparent as possible that a challenge could theoretically take that long. And then just Alex, just building off of your point earlier about, I think we're seeing a lot of localities really confront this problem of not having something that is viable, a data set that's viable for a bulk challenge, either on the location side or on the availability side. Because what we can get into a little bit more is that the most common way to show that an area didn't have broadband available prior to this map was to have, a speed test campaign of some type and collecting that. And the FCC is not looking at speed tests for this map. The rationale being that the argument being that a speed test shows maybe a point in time of what that service was rather than the maximum speed that could potentially be available if someone subscribes to the highest tier possible. So that's what they're trying to map with this map, and that's their kind of justification for why they're not using speed tests, which is probably the most common form that state and local governments were previously using. So absent of a viable data set to submit a bulk challenge at hand in this very short period of time of when this map came out, when the licenses became available, and this new January deadline, we've seen a lot of folks lean on a crowdsourced campaign to try to get people to do exactly what I was just saying. Look up your own address, see which providers are claiming to service your location and at what speeds, and do a little fact checking at the individual level and say, you know what, I've asked for that provider to come out multiple times. I've checked on their website. It does not say that I have service there. I will click these buttons and say, I'm challenging this. they do not provide this service at my location, or they do not have this technology available for me. So we're seeing a lot more leaning on to get at this longer tail end of making sure the state has enough money so that they can reach every location within their state, or has an accurate amount of money compared to everyone else. So just a few of the knock-on effects that we're seeing.
To go back to a question that Ryan answered earlier too, thank you all so much for answering all that and really being succinct in them. I appreciate it. But back to Ryan's point too about the person that asked, the timeline is really challenging for this process. What all have you seen other people do, to really, and potentially other states, other communities, to get involved with pushing back against that timeline and being vocal in this, right? Like, how do we give people the opportunity to say that that was really difficult and this has been an extremely hard process for folks, right? I'd love to hear y'all's different answers on that too.
Yeah, so some of the things that we've seen are really about how communities are actually working together to do a lot of this work. So when we look at, there are a few communities in Vermont. So I believe it's 213 of the 252 communities in Vermont are part of what they call a communications union district. And those are alliances between two or more towns that partner to kind of deploy infrastructure, do data collection, pull all of these things together. So when it comes to maybe one community not having enough resources, or one community having a good idea of how to start to pull all of this stuff together, that those kinds of partnerships are really, really useful. And then we see other places, kind of like the way that Nichols in New York or Erie County are trying to kind of, as they're looking at deploying kind of open access networks, they're saying, okay, how do we work into our feasibility study those types of data collections that we need to do to ensure that we have usable data at the end of this that will then allow us to challenge the FCC's maps. So as communities are kind of planning for the future with money that's already kind of coming down the pike, they're trying to figure out how they can best then ensure that money that will eventually be here is going to be able to be put to the best uses, not just by their communities, but by their states as well.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just flag a few things that we're seeing from states and let other people jump into. I'll be succinct, Innocent. I'm so sorry. So obviously almost every state, if not all, are submitting some level of bulk availability challenges based on what they have, or have already submitted a bulk fabric challenge to earlier on in this process. We are seeing a number of states think about how they can help local governments in this process, either by being an aggregator or providing technical assistance. I know NTIA and the FCC have also said that they're committed to providing a level of technical assistance for anyone with questions or running into issues with the challenge portal. One kind of interesting program we've seen in Missouri is they've partnered with their university of, I think it's the University of Missouri, the Mizzou, extension offices across the state, which I think they have an extension office in either every county or just about every county. And they've trained, the staff in there have been trained to help individuals file an availability challenges. So anybody could walk into a Mizzou extension office and file and be walked through the process of how to access the map, compared to what they know, and if necessary, file a challenge for their address. So I'll be really excited to hear from that state broadband office and from the university partner, just to hear how that process has been going, but a really cool partnership to try to get this more readily available for communities and for individuals.
I have a question that I'll pose to the group that just kind of comes down to the brass tacks of getting this stuff done. If you are going to submit a bulk challenge, either on behalf of the municipality or a county or government, or on the behalf of an ISP or as a third-party consultant working for one of those entities, you need to get access to the portal and you need to get access to the data. How hard is that to do? How long does that take? What do you need to do to do that? Is that Can anybody here speak to that a little bit? Christine, that's
Yes, I can take that one because I successfully finally received our copy of the fabric last week. And so the process is fairly similar at this point for any entity that's applying to receive the fabric. You have to, create an account in the FCC broadband data collection system. You have to apply for an FCC federal or FCC registration number, the FRN. And then you link those things, and then you're able to go to CostQuest and submit an application to get a license. And I can't remember now, like they've changed versions of the license, like the tier levels. We are on tier 4 license, for example. And so those different tiers have different levels of what you're able to do and share. And then there's kind of some back and forth with CostQuest with getting the signatures and things like that. For us, it took, I think, a month and a half or so. So for folks that are thinking that, they could try and get it now and submit something, that's not like really feasible for this week. But again, this is an ongoing process. So, if you're interested in doing this, especially for your community, and you want to make sure all your community's locations are on the map and your availability data is corrected, then it's definitely worth the effort to go in there and get this process rolling.
Now, and just to clarify, the tier 4 license that your organization has is a different license than a municipal jurisdiction would have, and it's a different license than an ISP would have. It's also a different license that than you would have if you were given a seat on a certain municipal jurisdiction's account, right? So if you were going to help them in a consultant capacity, you could be given a seat on their account to access the data. Is that true? So there's a kind of of ways you could.
Yeah, I don't pretend to understand all the interactions between the tiers, but I know, if you have similar tiers, I think you're permitted to discuss and talk about what's in your version. Yeah, I guess I shouldn't go too far down that road.
Wow, I guess clearly they got to you once you signed the agreement. That's interesting. Okay, well,
yes, the license is kicking
in. The FCC does regulate the airwaves, so they'll know. Great.
Sorry, Alex Kelly. Do you have I was gonna say, one of the other questions that we got from folks before they submitted, make sure if you do have questions, feel free to keep typing them in the chat box. This has been wonderful for some organic content too, but just for folks that had the questions earlier on, how does one challenge when you do not have broadband access at your home right now? What are the thoughts for that from this team? How do you make that possible?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? That's one of the big things that we've been grappling with for as long as this process has been live, is that we are asking people who are not counted by this map, who may not have internet access, to stand up and say something. But then the only option that we're giving them is to have to do this online. And for some people who might just have to walk down the street to go to a public library or a public computer center to challenge the map, that's very easy for them. But when we start to talk about the people that are in the remote areas of the country who would face a significant travel distance or significant travel times to be able to get to an area where they would be able to use a computer, or even just to travel somewhere where they might have a strong enough cellular signal, there's unfortunately no easy answer for how we get them connected to the resources to challenge the map that's supposed to then help them get connected to the resources. So we're still kind of in this unfortunate cycle of, we need better maps to get better connectivity across the nation, but we can't do that without this kind of data.
One thing I've seen that a few states are trying to get at this problem. The state broadband office in Ohio had they'd already had a map essentially targeting where they knew of unserved locations or underserved locations within their states, and they put a radius around those addresses and sent out I think some 60 to 80,000 mailers in person over the mail with information on how to file a challenge, I believe a number that you could call, as well as an email address if you had questions, and could get to an internet connection to ask it. I know a few other states have set up hotlines. Mississippi comes to mind. I believe they have a hotline that they've been advertising to that if you have nothing, no connection in your house, no ability to easily access this map to file a challenge, you could call a hotline, 1-800 number, and have someone talk through that challenge process.
Oh, cool. Thank you, Jake. So hotline could be a good way that communities could kind of post that around too, to be able for residents that may not have broadband access. You do need at least a cell phone service or a landline to be able to do that though. So those are also some of the restrictions in rural communities, but thank you, Jake. That's really helpful, I think. We're going to go to one question that we've just topped in the chat box that I thought was pretty interesting too, that we also got beforehand. So in the snowbelt season, our seasonal residents are not in their vacation homes to take the FCC map availability test. Consequently, availability tests will not reflect the accurate data from seasonal residents. How does the FCC compensate for the lack of accurate availability test? And Christina, I know we talked about, you had some questions about this early on as well, if you want to take that one.
Sure, yeah. So I'm based in Maine, and I think in a lot of these more rural states, everybody has not everybody, but a lot of people have their camp or cottage on the lake or out in the woods, and they're interested in having internet there. Unfortunately, speed tests are not going to be included as a form of challenge in this process, in the form of availability challenges. And to make that even more confusing, when you look at the availability challenge form, there is an option to select an availability or the speed test as a reason for the challenge. However, it's important to know that that does not constitute an actual challenge. It sends more of a complaint, kind of a bit of information to the FCC, and they are essentially at liberty to use that information how they will. Likewise, states, there are a number of states that are compiling speed test data, which I think still remains to be seen how the states will be able to use speed test data in their allocation process for the funds that they receive. That is still kind of ongoing, trying to understand what they will and will not be able to do when it gets down to that. Not like a clear answer yet, but in terms of the challenge process right now for the statewide allocations, speed tests are not going to be permitted.
Yeah. One point to add on to that. So, I mean, well, you can remotely collect evidence that your location is not served, kind of in the way that Jake was talking about earlier, where if you can document that the provider, you could put your seasonal address into the checker that says if you have service available, and the ISP may tell you no, and you take a screenshot of that, for example, or you call them and you document that can happen while you're not in your home. But I think the real the thing that's annoying about this, of the many things that are annoying, one of them is that individual challenges, which a lot of communities are asking people to do because that's the best tool that they have if they don't have bulk challenge opportunity. Individual challenges are not going to move the needle very much unless you can get everyone to do it. Because, for example, if you've got 3 houses in a row and the middle house successfully challenges on an individual basis and shows that that Comcast doesn't provide service there, even though they say they do on the map, or even, that doesn't affect the ones on either side. Or even if the ones on either side do that challenge and the middle one doesn't, right? We're not the cost quest is not making any inferences based on successful individual challenges that they could about where, what that actually means for the broader region. So that's one of the truly frustrating things about this map, is that the individual challenges are a way for people to put their effort to this. But we should try for the bulk challenges if at all possible, because that will be much more effective.
Yeah, I'd love to just add on to that, because there's this, I think, pretty large outstanding question. And if we have any of our friends from the FCC listening in, I'd love some more information on this. But the FCC does have the authority and the discretion to investigate the data that has been submitted by a provider. And if you are seeing, if one person on a block says that that provider is not service their location, there is maybe a reasonable doubt that they provide that same level of service that they've claimed for that person's neighbor or the person across the street. And so it's a question of what degree the FCC is taking that authority that they've put in their guidance to investigate this data that's submitted beyond the individual challenge, and if it's demonstrating any broader themes within that provider's reported data. I think there's also maybe an additional layer of scrutiny that could be cast because providers have two options to report their data. They can either submit based on these individual dots on the map, the unique locations that we can all see on the map, or they have an option to upload a shape file, a polygon showing the radius of their coverage, and that would then be supplanted onto the individual locations, right? So they can draw a circle essentially and say we service this shape, and all the locations that show up within the shape will have our service available to them. The accuracy of those shapes and the dots within them, though, is maybe something that is, let's call it a learning curve, or this first edition is really putting that process to the test. And so I think there's an additional question, is if the FCC is exerting additional scrutiny on providers that use that shapefile upload process to, if it's as accurate as those that use the individual unique location IDs. There's like a third level of, if a provider use the exact same shape that they had previously been using for the old census version of the maps, if they maybe didn't understand that the process had changed and that they needed to be much more accurate with their reporting, there's maybe an additional level of scrutiny for those providers. So the FCC does have some authority, and they also have the authority to fine providers if they are purposely submitting faulty data. And providers have within 30 days by FCC's rules, they have within 30 days if they detect a discrepancy on their own, or if they are notified of a discrepancy, they have 30 days to correct the data. And that is outside of the challenge process. So just a question of, how much the FCC is actually taking these authorities. And I would love to know more about the resources dedicated to that from the commission.
Yep. And I just wanted to touch on something that Christine said kind of back at the beginning of this. When we're looking at some of the speed test data that states are collecting, that is certainly useful for them to include in their maps that they are making on their end of things. The NTIA has been very clear that they are willing to accept plans that include state-based data, including that speed test, as long as there is also that incorporation of the FCC's map. The NTIA has essentially said that as long as the states aren't just trying to throw out the FCC's map and use all of their own data, that generally whatever they bring to them that includes their own state data will be acceptable in that plan. So I think there still is worth in doing those speed tests and in collecting that data, because it certainly allows states to kind of give a little bit more of their nuanced views, rather than just saying, here is the kind of weird qualitative data that the FCC is looking for.
Yeah, and sorry to keep jumping in and belaboring these points, but when we get to what Ryan just got at there, what NTIA is requiring for states is after they set this their funding allocation formula, it allows states to submit an initial proposal of how they would use that funding. And within that, they have to describe their own, well, it's called a challenge process again. So that's, it's annoying that phrase applies to multiple things, but a state will have to propose their own challenge process for how they will systematically determine within their state which areas are eligible for funding. They have to start with the latest version of the FCC map, but they do not have to stop with the latest version of the FCC map. They can apply additional data sets. They can apply, if they have a speed test campaign, they could theoretically apply something like that. There's a whole host of different eligible categories too that they can deploy in order to match this speed funding program and determine which areas are eligible. So that's something also to keep in mind, that this is not necessarily the end for determining whether or not your community or your individual location is eligible for funding. But this early deadline is kind of the very first benchmark to determine whether or not your state will have the proportionate, like reasonable share of the pie to reach as many unserved locations as possible, or as ideally all of the unserved locations within their state, to meet with the impetus of this program, of the BEAD program, which is to provide high-speed, reliable, affordable internet access for all.
Cool. Thank you all so much for those. I'm also going to go ahead and just call out, because I know Christine answered it, but I just want to make sure that people could see it. A person said, to clarify, location challenges can still be submitted after January 13th, but availability challenges need to be submitted by the 13th. And Christine's answer, both can be submitted after the 13th, but only availability challenges submitted by the 13th will be included in those BEAD allocations. So if that's not clear, David, type again and we'll let you know again. But just to let you know, that was a question that got asked. And I'm also really interested in getting to Eric's question in the chat box. He said, apologies if this has been covered elsewhere, but have you all seen good examples of counties and communities putting together campaigns to crowdsource data? Can you point us to one or more of those examples if you can?
I can take this real quick. So that's a great question, Eric. I think a few kind of general principles about the crowdsourcing kind of efforts. In rural areas, you need to reach people in as many different ways possible. Let me just say a blanket statement. The more effort and people you are able to put into it, the better the results will be. But obviously, the more effort and more people you're able to put into it, the more annoying it is and more difficult it is, right? So, the results are proportional to the reward. To the investment, I'm sorry. There's the example Jake gave of 80,000 mailers in the state of Ohio is a good one, but on a local level, I think the entities that are doing the best have tapped into a grassroots kind of energy and annoyance about broadband in their communities that existed and was able to be tapped into, and they are trying to couple that with other broadband related efforts so that it's kind of building more of a movement and a culture around it rather than just dipping into it as a one-off exercise. And so, jurisdictions that are trying to collect people's names and information for a pre-subscription campaign where you are trying to get people to sign up saying that they would like service as soon as it is available. That's a common tool in the planning process of a network. Right, they're coupling those efforts with efforts to crowdsource and correct the data. But again, to my earlier point, the more different channels you can try to reach people, especially in rural areas, the better, whether that's handing out little postcards at the dump, phone trees, flyers, Facebook, town listservs, that type of thing. Diversity of outreach strategies, clear communication about what to do, range of trusted people involved in the community talking about it, and then it's kind of creating that echo chamber. So I think those are some of the things that I would think about.
I think was Dr. Christopher Ali in his book, not for this mapping program, but highlights a community that put stickers on pizza boxes for delivery as a way to get people to respond and just get it in front of more people. So yeah, there's a lot of creative ways to get the word out, but for this for this deadline, it's coming up very quickly. But as we've talked about, there's a longer tail and a need to continue to improve this map over time beyond just this Friday deadline. And I already flagged this comment, so this question that came in, but someone did flag the campaigns that Maine, the Connect the Dots program, Connect the Dots campaign, and then my personal favorite, Wisconsin's Badger the FCC campaign as well, that their state broadband offices are running. So yeah, a good place to start if you are a community that's looking to ramp up a very quick crowdsourcing effort. See if your state has already started a crowdsourcing campaign that you could make sure that you could help broadcast within your community, or add on, or add a level of local personalization for it to raise awareness.
And we can also, I know that we mentioned that this webinar is put on by the National Broadband Resource Hub. That is a website that you all will get a link to afterwards to hopefully go on there and sign up and join that community. And there will also be hopefully we can do post about that in the future on there, like, what state broadband offices are doing what to make sure that communities are connected. We know that's a really hard thing for municipal leaders right now who are thinking about 1,000,001 other issues in their communities too, to also really put broadband at the forefront of it. So that is a resource for you all to go on there and utilize, and hopefully it can help you. And there's a help desk portion to that resource as well. And so ask questions, feel free to pick our brains after this webinar too is over with, because we want to be that resource for people on the ground right now. I think that was a wonderful segue into that, Jake. So thank you. And I know we've got some more questions coming in. If speed tests are not ideal, how does an individual challenge data in a crowdsourcing efforts?
The best thing to do is document that you have tried to request service and it has been denied. So whether that's, taking screenshots of putting your address into those address checkers that tell you, whether you can be served or not, or whether you document the times you have called and been told no, right? However you can document that. I think that is the best way to go about it. Ryan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. So I was going to say that is one. There's, I think, a list of 10 of these criteria. One of them is if you call and they are not willing to do it. That's one of them. If you call and they say yes, but they fail to schedule that installation within 10 days, that's another way to get there. If you schedule something within that 10-day window, and at that point, your installer just doesn't show up, that's another challenge. If you call them and say like, hey, according to the national broadband map, you guys served me with fiber, and the person on the other end of the phone says, no, we don't. That's a challenge in and of itself. And then there's two that are more wireless specific. One is if there's just no wireless signal or there's no satellite signal, and the other being if there is some kind of new or non-standard equipment that's required to connect your home. Like if they need to do some kind of construction, either by building like a wireless station or like a conduit or a piece of conduit or something like that, that would be grounds for another challenge. And then the last one, and I'll kick it to Christine, is if those installation charges would be kind of greater than what they would be normally for like a standard install. So like if your neighbor would cost like $50 to hook up their house, and they're like, well, we want to charge you 20 grand because we have to run something across the street, that would then constitute another challenge as well. So a lot of what it is very qualitative data that they're looking for, things that really the person who is trying to get broadband access would be able to tell somebody, but it's not really like we're not playing a numbers game here. We can't go out and like collect numbers of things like this. It is really specifically about like lived experiences.
And I just wanted to share, maybe we can add this to the resources that are emailed out later, but we put together
Yes.
what I think is a pretty helpful like click-through guide, and it has those list of different examples of reasons that you can create a challenge, as well for both the availability and the location challenges. And there are really detailed instructions for how to go through the challenge process and do that process. And there's videos as well in case you prefer video. So we can send that out afterwards as well.
And then I'll mention as well, because Jake so kindly reminded us in the chat that there is a box that you have to check that specifically notes that you are submitting this as a challenge to the FCC. If you don't check that box, it is just sent as a piece of the crowdsourced data process or an informal complaint, and that will not be reflected on the maps.
Yeah, I should know. I don't think, I think people click the if you get to the point where you can click the availability challenge, it then brings up a secondary box that you can click the reasons, and then you do have to select, as Ryan was just saying, I am sending this as to the FCC and to the provider, this challenge, and then you provide documentation. The provider has, is it 60 days? Someone correct me if I'm wrong, 60 days to respond to that challenge. If they refute the challenge or they do not agree with it, the challenger again has 30 days to respond to it, and for them, the provider and the challenger, to come to some resolution. So a provider rejecting the challenge outright does not necessarily make it just go away. If you never get it to the provider, though, if you don't click the right boxes or provide the right level of information, the FCC may not count it as a valid challenge. So getting that data input correctly for an individual is pretty important. Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's important information, and is another example of how great this process is. But I would like to also ask people to clarify, there are some important distinctions between challenging a wireline provider and how the wireline data is treated, which is basically, connected by wires, right? Versus challenging a wireless service provider and how wireless data is considered. Does somebody want to talk about some of those differences?
I mean, I'll say the biggest difference is for a wireless availability challenge, a speed test will get you there. The discrepancy between those two things, we have not gotten a good answer from the FCC as to why they are kind of playing this fun double standard, but you will be able to use speed tests for a wireless challenge. That is a completely separate, not separate map, but there is a separate tab on the National Broadband Maps website that you have to click after you search for your address. That will then show you which providers are covering you with wireless signal and allow you to do the same kind of either fabric or availability challenge as well. There are substantially similar challenge criteria, except for the fact that the one changes under wireless. The speed test will actually get you a wireless challenge.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. We've got around 7 more minutes or 6 more minutes. So if anyone's got a last minute question to put it in the chat box, please do so. But, one question that I think that I really want to have answered right now is, if you're getting on this call, you have no idea some of the things that anybody else on this call has said right now or previous to, and you're a rural leader or municipality who has no idea where to start in this process and doesn't really know what's going on, what would be your first initial step? What would be the advice to those people that you would give right now in this?
Yeah, I'll give a first quick bit of advice. This is like the broadband moment where the country is coming together to try to fix this for the long term. And so my advice would be to figure out a way that you or someone on your staff can make paying attention to what's going on in the broadband process part of their weekly routine. Spend a couple hours, set aside a couple hours to read up and follow along with the broadband processes every week. The unfortunate reality is that even though there's billions of dollars that's going to be available for broadband, there's not enough to cover every community with future-proof fiber to the home infrastructure. And so the communities that are the biggest risk of missing out are those that don't have the capacity or have not set aside time to make sure that they are as prepared as possible. So that's my first piece of advice. And then if you want to specifically get plugged in and then work on the mapping and challenge process, which is what we've been talking about today, I would say, learn up on everything. Christine has some great resources. The hub has some great resources. We're here to help. And then make a plan to kind of go through the challenge process using whatever resources your community has available. So that plan involves what data do you have that you could use for a bulk challenge process, which could be maybe you have good data on where infrastructure is. Maybe you have data on pole attachments, encroachment agreements, right-of-way stuff. Maybe you don't, right? If there's no bulk data, then the second best option is the crowdsourced data. So is your state running a program? If so, how can you promote that locally? If not, what do you need to pull together to do something for your community? So I'd say get plugged in, buckle up, devote some staff time to it, and then work your way through this kind of triage or hierarchy of needs, as we've kind of been talking about.
And I would just throw in a plug that your state broadband office is going to be critical over the next few years and has already probably started being in your states. They are the main vehicle for dispersing the Treasury's capital projects funds, which has a very strong emphasis on states using it for fiber programs and fiber deployment, as well as this BEAD program that we've been talking about. So definitely make yourself familiar with your state broadband office and the programs that they currently have available and the ones that they are planning for right now, because every state has received funds from NTIA to develop a 5-year action plan. Those will be due later this year for every single state. And so make sure that you're involved in that process, because they are required to engage with local leaders to make sure that what they are putting forward for their 5-year action plan is reflective of the needs that you have as a community.
Cool. Well, thank you all so much for taking an hour out of your time today to help answer these questions for folks. I know that I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that everyone on the call did too. For everyone on the call, we are going to be sending out a wrap-up email that will have the recording from this. It will also have some of these questions and the resources that people had submitted to the chat box. So when you can see, good fabric challenges or whatnot, and good bulk challenges that people have submitted. So we'll make sure that those resources are available to people afterwards. And as I said, National Broadband Resource Hub, we will also be putting a link to that in there. There is a community conversations page on the National Broadband Resource Hub. You must apply to get onto that page, and the application process can seem a little daunting. It is not. We just want to make sure that we have the aspect of understanding, where are you coming into this space from, whether that be a municipal leader or whether that be a volunteer who's just trying to get started for the first time in their community. Any of it is widely accepted and okay, but we're going to make sure that we hopefully have a pathway for you once you get on that hub to make sure that you're getting the best use out of it as you possibly can. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to us afterwards. But thank you all so much for taking time out of your Tuesday to join us. And the countdown to the maps have begun, everybody. So thanks everybody for being on.